welcome. Thank you guys so much for coming today. And we have a lot of people online too. So I want to thank everyone online for being here. So this is the first in our series, our spring lecture series, which is now called the Margaret Trush Owen Lecture Series. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I will tell you some about our speaker today and about our series. So as many of you know, Margaret was the founding director of the Center for Children and Families, and she built such an amazing place here. A lot of what she built is about this idea of moving together the community with science and bringing those two together. What a lot of people know about are our outreach programs like Play With Me and Grow With Me in the community, where we really take evidence-based research and do programs within the community to support the lives of children and families. Another part of that is this lecture series, and this was actually the first thing that was created by the center. The idea is for us to take science, and especially starting with the spring lecture series, local scientists at local universities to talk about the work that's going on in ways that are accessible to people within the community who are working with children and families throughout the DFW area. And then at the end, we have our forum. So this is the first in our series, and this really helps extend the vision that Margaret created here. So congratulations. This is now named the Margaret Trush Owen Lecture Series through the generous donation of an anonymous donor who wanted to name the series after her in honor of her. So congratulations. I do want to say that. And I want to tell you just our other speakers today too. So today we have Dr. Yoon. So I'll tell you a little bit about her, but also on Friday, February 21st, we will have Dr. Sarah Kutcher, who actually was a postdoc at the Collier Center, but she is now a faculty member at SMU. And she'll be talking about tech and talking, how pervasiveness of digital media impacts language development. And then we will have on March 7th, Dr. Michael Siller, who is at UNT. He just started at UNT running the Autism Center there, and he'll be talking about supporting children with autism in naturalistic settings. So we have a great series, and we are starting off with our own UTD professor, assistant professor. Dr. Yoon is an assistant professor in psychology at the Center for Vital Longevity. She is also an affiliated faculty member for the Center of Children and Families. Her research is really looking at how adolescents and young adults process social and performance information about themselves and how they use that to construct their sense of self, shape emotions, and adapt behavior. Her work aims to contribute to the prevention and treatment of mental health challenges such as low self-esteem, perfectionism, and rumination, as well as interpersonal difficulties. So I think she is a great person to kick off our series and talk about adolescence and mental health. All right, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for introduction, and thank you so much for coming to this talk this early morning. So to begin, I'd like to share my personal story as an adolescent girl. So until I was 11-year-old, I didn't know how to study at all. So my parents were quite worried about me because my focus was entirely elsewhere, like being popular among my friends and K-pop. And schoolwork was the last thing in my mind.
This doesn't work. We usually have a mic.
Okay.
Is the mic? Okay.
So, but one day, just 3 weeks before an important exam, I mentioned to my friend that I wanted to do well in the exam. I probably sounded a bit ambitious, but her response caught me off guard. So she said, "You can't do that. Maybe you will get an acceptable grade, but you won't be the top of the class." So her comment made me quite angry. It was awakened something inside me. So for the next 3 weeks, I studied so hard, staying up until 2 a.m. each night, driven by a desire to prove her wrong. When the results came, I not only succeeded, but I placed first in the entire school. But this experience taught me how to study, so my friends' remarks suddenly resolved all my parents' concern. This moment happened when I was 11 years old, the age when puberty begins and emotions become intensified. The adolescence is a time when we are particularly sensitive to feedback from others, especially feedback about our performance or social standing. So for me, in this case, that sensitivity fueled my motivation and academic achievement. But some cases, it can lead to very different outcomes: low self-esteem, interpersonal conflicts, depression, or social anxiety, are things that can impact the life beyond adolescence. But this sensitivity to social and performance feedback during adolescence, its vulnerability and its potential, is what drives my research. I study how adolescents, broadly defined as ages 10 to 25, process, respond to, and learn from social and performance feedback. And my goal is to understand the brain's role in shaping these responses. In our lab, we invite participants to perform tasks like giving a speech, creating artwork, or sharing their photos. Later, they receive feedback from others about their performance or likability. By using fMRI, we can observe how their brains react to this feedback and how these reactions connect to their behavior. So today, I'd like to share what we've learned about how the adolescent brain processes feedback and is influenced by self-relevant feedback and why this understanding is important. The first study I'd like to introduce addresses two key questions. How do behavioral responses to social performance feedback vary as a function of age during adolescence? What brain mechanisms underlie these developmental differences? To answer these questions, participants visited the lab twice, 2 weeks apart. During their first visit, they were asked to create a piece of artwork using one or two materials from a set of items as creatively as possible. They were told that other participants would evaluate their artwork over the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, participants returned to the lab for an fMRI task. Imagine that you created this artwork during your first visit. In the MRI scanner, you first viewed feedback from a partner, for instance, Sarah, who rated your artwork as not creative. Next, you view Sarah's artwork, and then rated whether it is creative or not creative. So this process was repeated with 75 different partners. And participants received a mix of positive, negative, and neutral feedback. So this setup allowed us to study two key behaviors in response to social feedback. One of them is called immediate feedback effect, which means participants immediately react to currently received feedback by giving negative feedback to the partner. For example, if Sarah gave you negative feedback, participants were more likely to retaliate by giving Sarah negative feedback in return. Another type of behavior is called cumulative feedback effect, which is to integrate feedback over time from multiple partners and giving the current partner negative feedback when the general consensus is negative. For example, let's say Joe gave you negative feedback, Millie gave you positive feedback, Kate gave you negative feedback, and Julie gave you neutral feedback, so that the cumulative feedback value is negative. You're more likely to give the current partner, Sarah, negative feedback, even if she hadn't given any negative feedback herself. So when we analyze the age-related differences in immediate and cumulative feedback effect, we found that immediate feedback effect decreases with age. Younger adolescents exhibited stronger immediate reaction to negative feedback, retaliating directly against the person who gave them negative feedback. This behavior decreased with age, which makes sense because immediate retaliation is visible, reactive, and potentially impulsive, characteristics that adolescents may learn to inhibit over time. Meanwhile, cumulative feedback effect increased with age. Older adolescents integrated feedback from multiple people over time, and their behavior was influenced by the overall tone of this accumulative feedback. This behavior reflects a more complex, covert form of self-protective behavior that may emerge as adolescents develop a broader perspective on social feedback. We then examine how brain activity explains these behavioral differences. We found that younger adolescents showed heightened activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex when receiving negative feedback. The VMPFC has a critical role in attaching personal significance to events and triggering emotional responses. And this heightened activity explains younger adolescents' instant response to single negative feedback. Meanwhile, older adolescents' cumulative feedback effect was associated with activity in both the VMPFC and the rostromedial prefrontal cortex. The VMPFC might have assigned weight to the cumulative feedback, while the rostromedial prefrontal cortex, implicated in episodic memory and far-sighted decision-making, may help track long-term patterns and guide more socially appropriate and complex behavior. In addition to brain activity, we also examine the contribution of brain structure measures called gray matter volume. Gray matter contains neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, and synapses, which are involved in processing and transmitting information. And gray matter volume is the measurable amount of gray matter in specific brain regions. Gray matter volume increases during childhood, peaks in late childhood or early adolescence, and it decreases across adolescence. Due to synaptic pruning, a process where unused or unnecessary neural connections are eliminated to make the brain work more efficiently. So in this analysis, we found that younger adolescents had larger gray matter volumes in regions including pregenial anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral orbitofrontal cortex. These regions are crucial for emotion regulation and social reward-based learning, respectively. And also, larger gray matter volume in these regions correlated with stronger immediate feedback effects. This suggests that their still developing brain structure contributes to instant emotional reactivity. So to conclude, we found developmental differences in feedback responses. That is, younger adolescents react visibly and immediately to single instances of negative feedback, while older adolescents integrate feedback over time and adjust their behavior accordingly. And these differences were partly rooted in the differences in brain's developmental stage, both in terms of prefrontal cortex function and structure. So there are several implications of this study. First, it can guide support for younger and older adolescents differently. So for younger adolescents who tend to exhibit immediate emotional responses, the focus could be on supporting emotion regulation and managing interpersonal conflicts. For older adolescents who integrate feedback over time, attention could be paid to cumulative effects of delayed outcomes of feedback. For older adolescents, the cumulative feedback effect presents an open question whether it is adaptive or maladaptive. So on one hand, it could be adaptive as it reflects their ability to buffer negative feedback with previously received positive feedback. On the other hand, it may be maladaptive because it indicates an increased risk of internalizing symptoms like rumination, because it means that brain constantly monitor and integrate others' evaluation over time, creating delayed or sustained impacts. An observation that directly inspired my second study. Another implication is that it can foster more empathy when younger adolescents immediately aggressively react to negative feedback because we understand that it could stem from still developing brain structure. Alas, this finding highlight the potential for brain-based interventions targeting prefrontal cortex development to help adolescents process social feedback more effectively. As I mentioned just before, finding the cumulative feedback effect in late adolescence ignited my interest in adolescent development of rumination. The rumination is repetitive thought patterns often triggered by a gap between what we want and what we experience. It's a mental habit many of us are familiar with, dwelling on mistakes or rejections. However, for some people, rumination becomes excessive, persistent, making it difficult to break free. So interestingly, like the cumulative feedback effect I discussed earlier, rumination also increases during adolescence, with steeper rises in girls than boys. Since rumination is a risk factor for various mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, it's crucial to understand the experience of high ruminators, such as how they process social feedback during this formative period. So my second study examined how adolescents with elevated levels of rumination respond to negative social feedback, both behaviorally and neurologically. So for this study, we recruited late adolescent girls aged 17 to 19. Participants completed a rumination questionnaire, which included items like, if I say or do something dumb, I tend to think about it for the rest of the day. When I make an error, I generally can't stop thinking about it. I spend a lot of time worrying about things I've done. Participants then engaged in a social evaluation task focused on likability. On their first visit, they viewed 60 photographs of peers and answered, "Are you interested in chatting with this person?" They categorized 30 peers as interested and 30 peers as not interested. They were also told that these peers would evaluate their likability in return. On their second visit, participants performed this task in an fMRI scanner. They first saw a peer's photo and a reminder of how they had rated that peer. Next, they saw feedback indicating whether the peer liked them, disliked them, or didn't rate their interest. Finally, they were asked, "How does this make you feel?" We recorded their emotional feelings as well as response times. So our first analysis examined how rumination influenced participants' feelings and response times after receiving negative feedback. Girls with high rumination tendencies did not report stronger negative emotions than others. However, they took significantly longer to report their feelings, particularly when the negative feedback came from peers they liked. At the neural level, high ruminators showed heightened activity in two key brain regions called posterior medial prefrontal cortex and precuneus. These regions are involved in conflict processing and mentalizing, like understanding others' thoughts. So high ruminators may interpret negative feedback from liked peers as conflicting with their expectation or desire, triggering mental analysis like, why does this person dislike me? This cognitive process likely explains their slower emotional responses. We also observe heightened activity in different regions, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and inferior parietal gyrus, which are linked to cognitive control and working memory encoding. We also studied functional connectivity, which measure how two brain regions work together during specific events, in this case, when receiving negative feedback from peers that they like. High ruminators showed reduced connectivity between the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's emotion center, and brain regions important for emotion regulation and self-referential processing. So this reduced connectivity suggests that their brains may struggle to coordinate emotional and cognitive processes needed to manage distress adaptively. So these findings suggest that when high ruminators face rejection from peers that they like, their brains engage in various processes, including potentially mentalizing, conflict processing, memory encoding, prolonged emotion evaluation, emotion dysregulation, generating hypotheses and underlying cognitive processes which warrant further investigation. So this study has several implications. Therapy for high ruminating girls can use scenarios of rejection from liked peer to help them practice altering their thought pattern and emotional responses. Implementing interventions known to influence brain activity is also another implications. For example, walking in nature interventions have been shown to modulate SGACC activity. So our study suggests that such interventions could be also helpful for adolescent girls with high rumination tendency. So the studies I presented earlier focused on immediate neural responses to experimentally manipulated social feedback. However, our lab is also deeply interested in how naturally occurring social feedback impacts the adolescent brain in the long term. So for this study, we focused on peer victimization, an extreme form of negative social feedback, and its long-term effects on brain development. Importantly, we consider about victimization and perpetuation together, as prior research shows that these two often co-occur. Many adolescents who perpetuate also experience victimization and vice versa. So the goal of this study was to examine how trajectories of peer victimization and perpetuation over 3 years are associated with brain development during early adolescence. This work was led by Hamshita Sasidaru, an undergraduate student in our lab, with important contributions from our own Dr. Elva Tang, our collaborator. So we leveraged data from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, a large-scale longitudinal data set tracking the brain development, social experiences, and mental health of over 11,000 children in the United States. This data set offers a rare opportunity to analyze large longitudinal neuroimaging data that would otherwise be very challenging to collect. So in this study, we examined how victimization and perpetuation trajectories over 3 waves, waves 2, 3, and 4, is associated with changes in cortical thickness from wave 2 to wave 4. So what is cortical thickness? Cortical thickness refers to another brain structural measure, that is the distance between the brain's outer surface near the skull and inner surface near the white matter. So using longitudinal clustering analysis, we identified 4 trajectory types. Stably low victimization perpetuation trajectory, with minimal negative experiences across 3 years, which was the most positive group, and increasing victimization perpetuation, and decreasing victimization perpetuation over 3 years, and stably high victimization perpetuation, that is persistent high levels of negative experiences across 3 years, the most adverse group. Notably, victimization and perpetuation were highly correlated across all waves. So, for example, adolescents in the stably low group for victimization were also in the stably low group for perpetuation. It was the same for other groups. So we next examine how this trajectory affected cortical thinning in brain regions associated with social emotional functioning, such as cell processing and social cognition, emotion processing, and reward-based learning. Like gray matter volume, cortical thickness also decreases during adolescence, largely due to synaptic pruning, a normal developmental process that enhances brain's efficiency. So we were wondering how those four victimization perpetuation trajectories is associated with these normative neurodevelopmental processes. We also explored how biological sex and racial minority status moderated these effects, as neurodevelopmental trajectories are very different for males and females, and social stress can affect the neurodevelopment differently for minority adolescents. So we found that white boys with stably high victimization perpetuation trajectory showed accelerated precuneus thinning reflected by this very steep decline in cortical thickness. In contrast, white girls in the same group showed attenuated precuneus thinning with a flatter trajectory. In non-white boys, stably high victimization perpetuation trajectories were associated with attenuated, flatter development in the lateral orbital frontal cortex, which is important for reward-based decision-making and learning. For non-white adolescents overall, decreasing victimization perpetuation trajectory compared to stably low trajectory were linked to slower medial orbitofrontal cortex thinning. So these are very complex data, but the broad pattern of research show that sustained victimization and perpetuation over multiple years can significantly alter adolescent brain development. However, the direction and affective brain regions were significantly different based on biological sex and minority status. For white adolescents, negative peer experience were linked to accelerated or attenuated brain development, depending on the biological sex, in regions associated with self and social cognition. In non-white adolescents, the same experiences were associated with attenuated brain development in regions involved in reward-based learning. Among non-white adolescents, decreasing victimization perpetuation were also associated with slower brain development in a reward learning related brain regions. So it's important to emphasize that we don't yet know whether accelerated or attenuated brain development is adaptive or maladaptive. On one hand, accelerated brain development might seem advantageous as it could signal earlier attainment of complex cognitive functions. On the other hand, it may lock in neuroplasticity early in life, reducing brain's ability to adapt to future social and environmental demands. So our findings don't provide definitive answers about adaptiveness. However, they demonstrate how the adolescent brain adapts to such a significant social stress across years. So this study expands our understanding of how negative peer experiences influence brain development across years, a challenge which has been a challenge in human neuroimaging studies. So we were very grateful about ABCD dataset, which were perfect for answering our research question. Also, as we gather more evidence on whether these neurodevelopmental patterns are adaptive or maladaptive in different contexts, this finding can inform targeted interventions. For example, interventions could focus on supporting neurocognitive development in adolescents affected by sustained or fluctuating negative peer interactions. To wrap up these 3 studies, adolescence is a period of heightened sensitivity to social feedback, shaping behavioral and neural development. The first study suggests that both younger and older adolescents seem to be sensitive to social feedback, but the temporal dimension of feedback they are sensitive is different. That is, there is developmental differences in immediate and cumulative feedback responses. It seems to be rooted in the prefrontal cortex maturations. And high rumination tendencies in girls is related to various distinctive neurocognitive processes, particularly in response to negative feedback from peers that they liked. And sustained victimization and perpetuation experiences during early adolescence are associated with distinct patterns of structural brain development. So I wanted to wrap up the talk with empathizing why studying the adolescent brain in social feedback context is important. Studying the adolescent brain uncovers underlying mechanisms of heightened feedback sensitivity, which can improve targeted interventions. And it generates many hypotheses about cognitive processes during and after receiving feedback, which is inaccessible through behavior alone. Because a single brain region or network often supports multiple functions, brain-based interventions targeting reasons. This reason can address a wide range of challenges from emotion regulation to social functioning. So related to this, I wanted to introduce our lab's research direction for upcoming years. Our lab will continue exploring how adolescents' brains process social and performance feedback in diverse contexts, such as exceeding or falling short of parental expectations, comparing themselves to peers or close friends, and navigating academic and social challenges. We aim to uncover how adolescents use this feedback to update self-esteem, shape thought patterns, and guide social behavior and learning. Our work will focus both on immediate neural and behavioral responses to feedback, as well as the long-term effects of cumulative experiences over time. Finally, we will investigate how social performance feedback processing impacts mental health, social relationship, and achievement, providing some actionable insights to support adolescents in fostering well-being. So please stay tuned for the lab's progress. And I wanted to take a moment to thank the students in our lab and our collaborators who make this work possible. Before I close, I wanted to share some news. This week, our lab launched our lab's Instagram account. So our goal is to connect more directly with the families in Dallas and anyone curious about the adolescent brain in social emotional context. So research takes time to make an impact and societal benefit, but we thought, why we wait? So with this account, we aim to make an immediate impact through science communication. We'll share bi-weekly posts about adolescent brain research in social and emotional context. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really great talk. I love this. I do have a lot of questions. I'll start with one. So I was really interested in the cumulative feedback idea, right? And so with adolescents, as kids get older, they're more affected by that in terms of giving negative responses later, right? So if you get a lot of responses and only a few positive, you're more likely to give a negative later. And that increases through 19 to 25, right? Are those the ages?
It's 10 to 25.
Seven, okay. So I'm wondering, you talked about this as, I wonder if there might also be some aspect of this that's related to noticing maybe the bar has changed with like that if you're getting lots of, so you made your artwork, right? You made something and you were like, I think this is good, and it's like a fun activity. And then as you see all these negative things, maybe you realize that the bar for what's considered good is lower than you thought, or is higher than you thought, right? So the feedback is showing not that there's necessarily any, but it's a better understanding of the overall expectations of the group, not necessarily that you're trying to get back at this other person, right? When you give that negative response, it might not be that you're angry because you got all these negative responses, and so you're like taking it out on this other person. But maybe it's because you realize that just the standards are really high, and you hadn't expected the standards to be that high at first. And then you start to judge more harshly because you realize everybody else is doing that. And maybe it's because there's just a really high bar for what's considered good. Is that, how do you tease those two apart? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a very important insight. So yeah, that makes sense because they also viewed others' artwork over time, like multiple trials, as they view much more many number of artworks. It could impact their standard of evaluations.
Yeah.
That's something you mean?
So seeing what but this is kind of preschoolers when they get into kindergarten, also, you know, preschoolers like, I can do everything, I'm amazing. And once they start getting evaluated in school, they're like, maybe not, you know, because they start to learn that that bar shifts. And I kind of wonder if that might be part of what's happening there too.
Yeah. One thing I can say is that and when designing this task sequences, we distributed the quality of the others artwork evenly across the trial. So it could partly cancel out the effects. But yeah, that's interesting point. So we could start from this effect and then see if whether those like changing standards or like viewing others artwork over time could moderate this accumulative effects.
Having insights on rumination, maybe. But in thinking about implications, you mentioned for adolescent girls who do a lot of ruminating, make them go on a nature hike. That can kind of help them calm down, put things into perspective. But it sounds like when we say like for girls who ruminate, that's like a pretty stable characteristic. So we can help maybe decrease the likelihood they experience or develop internalizing symptoms, but they're always going to be ruminators. How stable is rumination? And have you seen, you know, brain behavior interventions that can actually decrease the likelihood of ruminating?
And can you repeat the question for those online too? Just
Yeah, so the question was how much the rumination in adolescent is stable and what kind of, whether it is a stable characteristic and whether there is other interventions that was effective in reducing rumination. As like other like trait measures in developmental sample, rumination is one of the traits that changes steeply during adolescence. So we don't know whether if there is some unstable instability in measurement, whether we cannot like distinguish whether it's a developmental changes or is a problem of the measures. But the rumination measures is really very highly internally valid. That we use the response to stress measures. And for the interventions, I think the walking in the nature study was one of the major things that found that directly modulate the brain activity. But there is some evidence that exercising is also helpful, and also like cognitive behavior therapies that train them to think in a more constructive way rather than like analyzing the event, like why this has happened, but how we can overcome or how we can like make some distance or diverting our attention to other good things was proven to be a good approach.
I think this is really interesting. One thing I'm curious about is how feedback can feel different depending on how objective or subjective you think the criteria are for making a decision. So I'm thinking about like math contests, for instance. I have a kid who thinks he's good at math. He knows he's good at math because he gets all the math knowledge right. It's very objective to say he is good at math. And so if somebody said he's like at math, he would say, no, it wouldn't affect him at all, even if it was negative feedback, because he knows what the evidence that is objective truth. So think about the feedback that kids and adolescents are receiving. It can vary in terms of how much there's clear evidence or how subjective it feels like it is. So do you have thoughts on
And how
how?
integrated.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, when you talk about changes over time, I'm thinking, well, this is you're consolidating your self-image over time. And how you perceive things is related to how you perceive things in the past, and it accumulates. So.
So the question is the degree to which the feedback is subjective or objective, like a math test would be more objective test and like artwork would be more subjective. So the question is whether I think such a subjectivity could impact the research and sensitivity to feedback. So I think I don't know whether there is a study that try to disentangle those effect objectivity and subjectivity, but as you said, I believe that more subjective area, their responses would be more like intensive because there is a room to like interpret the feedback differently. They can externalizing the feedback to the judge's accuracy in the evaluations. So in the experimental setting, because we have to give evenly distributed positive and negative neutral feedback, the choice of the evaluation domain is usually subjective because it should be make sense that in the prospective participant, it should be makes sense that some people give positive feedback and some people give negative feedback. But yeah, I know that there is some new tasks that utilizing the math challenges, and I don't remember the results exactly, but that's a really interesting further direction to compare the evaluation, whether evaluation is subjective or objective impacts the responsivity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that as adolescents are growing and becoming more stable in their identity, that that's also influencing some of their perspectives about the feedback they're receiving?
So the question was the degree to which the stability of identity, probably as well as how much they think the being at a great at the artwork the importance of being a good artist could impact their responsibility. One thing I can say is that actually we measured how much they put effort in the artwork creation and also how much it was interesting to them and how much it is important to be creative. And then there was no age differences in our three measures, and it was not related to the our results. So yeah, and like developing a stable identity could be also related to our cumulative effects. So as they know that the more like cumulative experiences and multiple feedback and consensus is more important than a single person's evaluation, their identity could be more stable over time. Yeah, so that it can buffer previous feedback, can buffer their responses to intensified responses to single negative feedback.
So I can go ahead and ask. One was just within the ABC brain imaging data, in the victimization perpetrator study, do they, and race had an issue or had an effect related to the effects that you were seeing, right? There were different effects for white versus non-white participants. Someone is asking whether the race of the perpetrator when someone's a victim is also included in the ABC data, or if there's any information related to the race of the person who's the perpetrator compared to the participant.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The measure that we use is simply the self-reported measure. Like it included like physical aggression, like how much they experience physical aggression from others, as well as also social aggression, like spreading rumor, and also excluded them in unexciting events like that. So the source of the aggression was not measured in this study.
And there's another question online that's, you've talked a lot about others' opinions affect anxiety, but what about the effects of a child's conditions, i.e. lack of security, lack of love, lack of hope and anxiety? How do we reduce our children's anxiety?
It's a very important and broad questions. So yeah, as I saw in the second study, there is a lot of individual differences even in the same aged adolescents. It could be related to the most important thing could be the low self-esteem, and also even the cumulative negative experience in their developmental history, like parenting. So yeah, I don't have like clear answer about like how these complex things shape the responses, but yeah, definitely there is individual differences in terms of like trait and developmental history. Yeah.
Interesting graphs of changes over time that you're relating to changes in brain development. I'll get back to that maybe in a second. But I'm glad you mentioned there's a lot of individual differences because it's not something that you're talking about yet. And if you can say anything more about what you've seen in terms of individual differences in these trajectories or just variation at age times, because I would think, well, you talk about what you think about that.
Yeah. So the question is, how can I like expand my thoughts about the individual differences and yeah, how much variability in the responsibility to social feedback. Some interesting insight that I gained from the first study is that there is much more variability in younger children, like and early adolescents, and actually over time those variability becomes like less as they grow, potentially because there is some like socialization process occur that makes people similar over time. Yeah. Um, yeah, let me research more about the individual differences so that I can give more like expanded explanation. Yeah.
Show a lot. I think the way that you show the graphs is
Uh-huh.
really transparent and informative in terms of how much, because you show all your, so those dots, right? And just for people, all the dots are the individual responses. So you can see the range of variability that's there. And I thought that was nice the way you did it with the brain too, because the brain is incredibly variable, but you can still start to cluster and see this. So on those other graphs, I think you have many, many lines. Each of those lines is an individual person, right? And then
Yeah.
so I think that, so just showing that again might get to some of this of how much there is a lot of variability there. So, but you still can identify overall trends, it seems.
But it could be an additional focus of your might be, can we explain some of this variability?
Yeah.
Not just they're off track.
Yeah, of course.
Always are, you're always fighting. Okay, we're looking for development.
Development.
Are we looking for sustainability?
And
then that has implications, I think, for interventions, for prevention. That's where I would then turn back to, I don't know, I have this sense when we talk about brain is developing in this way. To me, brain developing, that sounds like, okay, that more and more permanent, we can't change it because the brain's developed.
Yeah, so all the brain development work is mostly focused on the mean trajectory, but now I think people appreciate the individual variability in the rate of brain development and the mean the level of the structural measures or functional connectivity and activity. Yeah. Yep.
So the graph that you showed, just rumination scores across from 10 to 25. I saw that like generally there was an increase, but then there's a dip at age 12, I think for both genders. So I'm not sure if it was,
This one. Okay.
yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how significant that, I mean, it's not too much, but I'm just curious about your thoughts about age 12.
Yeah, so the question is whether there is a like significant gender differences in each of this age, and particularly for age 12. So yeah, in every age, probably except 10 to 11, there seem to be a gender differences, very significant gender differences in girls and boys. But these gender differences seem to emerge probably as the puberty to initiate and then sets. So puberty is related to with changes in how individuals respond to the social stress. So it could initiate the gender differences, and also it also aligns with the as puberty starts earlier in girls, seems like rumination also start like surge earlier in girls.
It was a good back in a certain order, like where they showed like positive feedback and negative feedback in like consistent order, touching both, or because I know like touching negative feedback can have like a stronger like implication, like feeling that we like imprint on ourselves. So if that was controlled, or do you think like if it wasn't that change how they responded to the rate of the other person that rated them?
Mm-hmm. So the question was about the sequence of positive and negative feedback in the rumination study. So if I remember correctly, I believe this feedback was fully randomized. So so it's like the and also some restriction about like 2 or 3 feedback should be not the same one consecutively. Yeah.
It's like negative, positive, positive, negative, whatever feedback. Do you think it could change like how, maybe they view the other person, like they do being positive or negative?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. Like it could be also like related to my first study, because it's related to the like whether the previous positive feedback could impact the responses to negative feedback. I'm not aware of the study that directly tested whether negative feedback, positive feedback impacts responses to positive feedback differently, and positive impacts differently. Probably like according to like my intuition, it'd be very different. But it's really interesting further direction.
Thank you so much for fabulous stuff.
Thank you.